Hey there, poker enthusiasts! Terry Wood here from PokerRailbird.com. Today we're analyzing the various player styles. Every player brings a unique approach to the table, but they usually fall into one of four primary styles. In this video, we're going to break down these four key styles, give you the strategies to counter them, and help you develop a better game plan at the table. These four primary styles, tight aggressive, loose aggressive, type passive, and loose passive, are the foundation of understanding poker strategy. Each style has its own strengths and weaknesses, and knowing how to adjust your play based on your opponent's tendencies is key to maximizing your edge. So stick around as we break down each of these styles. Let's get to it. Before we dive into the specifics, it's important to remember that every player's style we'll discuss shares certain qualities with two of the other styles. There will always be some level of overlap. For example, the loose aggressive player shares looseness with loose passive players, but also shares aggression with tight aggressive players. This means that players often exhibit similar habits, motives, and psychological tendencies across these overlapping categories. Psychology in poker, like psychology in general, is an inexact science. What I'll outline here are broad principles that apply to these player types, but no two players are the same. The general trends we discussed may not fully describe a specific individual you're up against. That's why observation is key. Start with these general principles, but adapt based on what you see in real time at the table. Let's talk about my personal favorite first, the loose aggressive players. Identifying these players is rarely difficult. They're in almost every pot, raising and re-raising, often making their presence known with loud bets and even louder words. Other players at the table may assign them nicknames like Mr. Raise-A-Lot, which is one of my favorites, and Maniac is a term often thrown around for this type. Some players love having them at the table, myself included, but many others find them frustrating and disruptive because of their constant action. One thing's for sure, a loose aggressive player can never be ignored. When they have good cards, they can win a ton of money, but more often than not, they end up taking huge losses. That's one reason I enjoy playing against them. They create big opportunities, but they also take big risks. Loose aggressive players are some of the most attractive, exciting, frustrating, and even frightening opponents at the table. They appeal to our greed and desire for action, but can also irritate players with their wild behavior and relentless aggression. What drives this play style? The loose aggressive style is rooted in a lack of control. You can often spot them the moment they sit down. They're usually involved in most hands, raising and re-raising frequently. Many of them are loud or show off their bravado, urging others to gamble and criticizing the more conservative rocks, or wimps at the table. At the core, loose aggressive players, especially the more extreme types, like Maniacs, are driven by their addiction to action. Their behavior is rigid in its own way. You know they're going to raise and re-raise with nearly any hand. This can actually make them somewhat predictable, and with the right adjustments, you can take advantage. There are less extreme loose aggressive players who maintain more control and flexibility. While they still require strategic adjustments, they're more unpredictable and effective than pure maniacs. When playing against them, you'll need to constantly assess how they're playing at any given moment, as their style can shift suddenly and without warning. Here are a few common tendencies of a loose aggressive player. They often have loud voices, aggressive body language, and sometimes even flamboyant clothing or jewelry. They might flash their bankroll or drop hints about their wealth, like mentioning a Rolex or a fancy car. These players also tend to make excessively large buy-ins, straddle whenever they can, and bet or raise in the dark. You'll notice their aggressive, forceful gestures, and many of them carry a sense of nervous tension. The loose aggressive's main strength is the potential to win large sums of money quickly. They get plenty of action because they overplay many hands. But their weakness is just as glaring. Nobody loses money faster. Over the long term, nearly all loose aggressives are big losers, though many won't admit it. One thing to keep in mind when facing a loose aggressive is this: the key isn't in what they raise with, but when they don't raise. Because they raise with such a wide range of weak hands, when they only call, it lets you eliminate certain possibilities. For example, if the flop shows two hearts and they just call behind, they probably don't have a flush draw, as they would likely have raised with that hand. Should you play against a loose aggressive? That depends on your temperament. Many players feel confused, torn between gambling with them or tightening up out of fear. If you're a cautious, conservative player who dislikes risk and ambiguity, you might want to avoid these opponents altogether. If a maniac sits down, you may want to consider leaving the table. But if you choose to play against them, position is critical. Try to sit to their immediate left where they act before you. That way, you can see their move before committing to the pot. If they raise and you have a strong hand, you can re-raise or call, but if your hand is weak, you can fold without having invested any chips. Here are a few key strategies when facing a loose aggressive player. Don't try to bluff them, they love to call. Don't try to steal their blinds, they'll likely re-raise. Avoid betting or raising for value with weak positional hands that only seem strong because everyone else has checked. If you have a strong hand, raise or re-raise to isolate them. Let them take the lead, but when you have a powerhouse hand, don't hesitate to bet into them or check raise. They'll often call or even re-raise. Encourage them to bluff. Maniacs love bluffing more than anything, and with your strong hands, you can invite them to overcommit and make costly mistakes. Loose aggressive players bring a unique dynamic to the game, creating both opportunities and challenges. Whether you love them or hate them, you'll need to adapt your strategy to handle their relentless aggression. Remember, when facing a maniac, patience is your greatest weapon. Wait for a strong hand, take control when the opportunity arises, and capitalize on their mistakes. With the right adjustments, these players, who often rely on chaos, can become your best source of profit. Next up is the loose passive player, commonly referred to as a calling station. These players are among the easiest to beat, especially in lower stakes games, and they are abundant at those levels. Their style is driven by a need for social harmony and a deep aversion to conflict, which blinds them to the reality of poker, where patience and aggression are rewarded. Rather than waiting for strong hands and playing aggressively, loose passive players play far too many hands, and they play them passively. They are so uncomfortable with aggression that they allow other players to dictate the action. Instead of betting or raising, they call and call often. As you can imagine, this leads to a long series of significant losses. Unlike loose aggressive players, who are easy to spot due to their bold raises and loud behavior, loose passive players fly under the radar. They rarely raise either their bets or their voices. However, you can quickly identify them by their passive manner and their tendency to limp into almost every pot. There are more moderate loose passive players who exhibit some self-control and flexibility, and when playing against these types, you need to be cautious about applying hard and fast rules. You will still need to make adjustments to your strategy, but it requires more judgment, as these players can occasionally be more effective and unpredictable. Keep a close eye on how they are playing in the moment, as their behavior can shift from hand to hand. One constant, however, is that all loose passive players are long-term losers. In fact, they lose more consistently than any other player type, even maniacs. Once opponents recognize their play style, they bet into and raise them freely, knowing that the loose passive player will call even when they are obviously beaten. And when these players finally do make a strong hand and raise, they often get no action, as everyone at the table knows exactly what they have. Loose passive players present the worst of both worlds. They give action, but don't get it. This combination makes them the easiest opponents to exploit. Here are some key characteristics to help you identify a loose passive player. They often speak softly, use passive language, and display gentle gestures with a friendly, accommodating manner. Their demeanor is usually relaxed and placid, and they seem more interested in socializing than in the actual game. If they are chatting away without paying attention to the cards or the action, it's a clear sign they are a loose passive. These players tend to blend in. They wear nondescript clothing, have ordinary mannerisms, and generally avoid standing out. Watch for unnecessary posts. Players who post blinds out of position are often signaling a loose playing style. From a poker perspective, loose passive players offer no real strengths. They are socially well liked at the table, but from a financial perspective, they are consistently losing players. Winning just isn't a priority for them, which makes them ideal opponents. Their weaknesses are glaring. They spend a lot of money simply calling, and when they do make a hand, they rarely win much because they don't bet aggressively. On the rare occasion they bet, they often don't get called, as their timid nature makes them easy to read. As a result, they almost always lose, and they lose quickly. Reading a loose passive player's hand can be difficult since they'll play nearly any two cards. However, reading their betting patterns is quite simple. They won't bet without a solid hand, and their rare raises or re-raises should be a huge red flag. They almost always indicate a monster hand. Bluffing is extremely uncommon for these players, and when they do attempt it, you can often see their discomfort. Should you play against a loose passive player? Absolutely. These are the easiest opponents to beat. If you can't find success against them, it may be time to reconsider poker altogether. Let's talk about type passive players, often referred to as rucks. These players can be challenging to identify quickly, and beating them requires careful adjustments to your strategy. They earn the name ruck because of their extremely conservative and patient approach to the game. They sit out hand after hand, waiting for premium cards. Even when they do get strong hands, they play them conservatively, sometimes timidly. Type passive players can be difficult to spot because most of us naturally pay attention to the people who are involved in the action, not the ones who quietly fold. Rocks tend to keep a low personal profile. They often say very little, sometimes almost nothing at all. Even when they place a bet, it's done in a controlled, cautious manner. You won't hear them announce, "I raise," with force. Instead, they quietly place their chips in front of them, typically without fanfare. These players have mastered one crucial aspect of poker strategy. They play tight, and that tightness can allow them to win consistently in the right games. While they may not win big, they don't expect to. Rocks are content with a steady stream of small wins and occasional, minor losses. Unlike more emotional players, such as Maniacs or calling stations, type passive players are driven by a sense of control and conservatism rather than impulsive or emotional decisions. This conservative approach, especially in smaller limit games with many weak opponents, can actually be quite successful. However, like Maniacs and calling stations, rucks are also predictable. You can expect them to fold most hands, call with only premium hands, and raise only with exceptional ones. Their rigidity and cautious style make them easier to read and adjust to once you've identified them. Spotting a type passive player can be tricky because of their low profile. They play very few hands, rarely raise, and often remain quiet. The term rock fits them perfectly because they blend into the background. You can spend hours at the table with one and barely notice them. Here are a few telltale signs that you're dealing with a rock. They tend to display tight emotional control, often appearing calm and collected. Their clothing is neat, they wear little or no jewelry, and their words and gestures are passive, if not absent altogether. Their chips are usually organized meticulously, often arranged in neat stacks, signaling their desire for order and control. They may seem indifferent to other players, rarely engaging with the table, and often appear uninterested in the action. Rocks often buy in for the minimum to minimize their risk, and older players are more likely to exhibit this type passive style. Many retired players, seeking to pass time and earn a few dollars, fall into this category. The type passive player's greatest strength is their patience, and poker certainly rewards patience. Their style is effective in lower stakes games, producing a steady stream of small wins with very few significant losses. While their play style might bore most people, including themselves, it works well in games with weak competition. However, their major weakness lies in their inability to extract maximum value from their winning hands. They are highly vulnerable to bluffs, give away too many free cards, and rarely bluff themselves. When a rock raises or re-raises, you can be sure they have a very strong hand, possibly the nuts. Reading a type passive player's cards is relatively straightforward. They won't get involved without a solid hand, and they'll only raise when they're holding something exceptional. If they re-raise, it's almost guaranteed they have the best hand at the table, and you should strongly consider folding. Should you play against type passive players? If there are only a few rocks at the table and the other players are soft, then yes, they are manageable opponents. However, if the table is filled with type passive players, the game may become dull and unprofitable, so it's often best to look for more dynamic competition. We saved the tight aggressive player, or tag, for last because this is the style every serious player should strive to emulate. Nearly every top professional and the best players in any game are tight aggressive. They don't come to play, they come to win. Of the 4-player styles, tight aggressive is the only one not driven by natural tendencies. It is a deliberate choice requiring discipline and practice. While most players are motivated by natural desires, like a love of action or fear of conflict, tight aggressive players have learned to control those impulses. They've deliberately developed a style that poker rewards: controlled, selective aggression. Tight aggressive players wait for the right cards and the right situation. Once those conditions are met, they attack relentlessly. However, if new information arises or the situation changes, they're just as willing to back off or even fold. This style exemplifies poker's fundamental rule: never act without an edge, and when you have that edge, exploit it fully. Tight aggressive players are the most dangerous opponents at the table. Nearly all of the best professionals follow this style, as do the strongest players in any game. Poker isn't a casual pastime for them, it's a serious pursuit. Whether driven by financial need, a love of competition, or simply the thrill of winning, tight aggressive players approach the game with focus and determination. For some, it's their primary source of income. For others, it's a profitable second job that supplements their earnings. This style is far from natural because it combines two traits, tight control and aggression, that don't typically go together. Cautious people tend to avoid risk, while aggressive people often lack restraint. The only other professions where you might see this combination are high-stakes roles like fighter pilots or law enforcement officers. Because it's unnatural, developing a tight aggressive style requires hard work and discipline. Maniacs, calling stations, and rocks play according to their natural tendencies, but tight aggressive players are made, not born. Not only are tight aggressive players the hardest to beat, they're also the hardest to identify. While the other styles reflect a player's core personality, tight aggressive players have the discipline and motivation to create a false image. Some might talk loose but play tight. Others may act charming or sociable, while a few deliberately act obnoxious to provoke emotional reactions from opponents. In some cases, they may even feign being foolish or intoxicated to throw others off. So why would anyone choose to be disliked or regarded as a fool? Because, as Roy Cook said, it's not about winning respect, it's about winning chips. For a tight aggressive player, a weak player's opinion means little compared to the chips they can win. These players are constantly manipulating their image to get the results they want. Given their ability to mislead, you must carefully analyze tight aggressive players. Don't be fooled by their words or demeanor. Instead, pay close attention to how many hands they play, how often they stay and until the river, and, most importantly, how often they raise and take down pots. If a player folds frequently but plays their few hands with intensity, raising early but folding if things turn against them, and rarely reaches showdown without winning, you are almost certainly dealing with a tight aggressive player. Remember, tight aggressive players are selectively aggressive. They don't want a fair fight, they want to dominate with an edge. Raising and re-raising with a slightly better hand than their opponent isn't reckless gambling, it's smart poker. If you're trying to spot a tight aggressive player, look for certain characteristics. Discipline is the key. It takes a great deal of self-control to maintain the style. Alertness is another hallmark. Tight aggressive players are always paying attention. You won't see them fumbling for chips or asking whose turn it is. Even after folding, they remain focused on the action, studying opponents and planning future strategies. Intensity often radiates from them. Some can't hide their hunger to win. If you try to chat with them, they might dismiss you, focused solely on the game. This style has very few weaknesses. Poker rewards discipline, tight play, and selective aggression, qualities the tight aggressive player embodies. The only potential downside is that weaker players may avoid them, limiting their opportunities to get action. Tight aggressive players are notoriously hard to read. They control their emotions and their actions, rarely giving away tells. Their decisions are calculated, and their deceptive nature makes them formidable opponents. If they're in a hand, you can be sure they have a reason. So should you play against a tight aggressive player? The short answer is no. If one joins your game, it's best to avoid confrontations with them. If the rest of the game is soft, keep playing, but be much tighter and more cautious when they're involved in a hand. Now that we've covered the different styles of play, let's quickly recap. First, we have the loose aggressive player, who is always raising and creating action, often to their own detriment. While they can win big in the short term, their lack of control usually leads to big losses in the long run. Next, the loose passive player, or calling station, plays far too many hands and does so passively, making them the easiest opponents to exploit. Their tendency to call leaves them vulnerable. Then, we talked about the Typ Passive player, or rock. They sit out most hands, waiting for premium cards, but their conservative style makes them predictable and easily exploited by more skilled players. Finally, we discussed the tight aggressive player, the ideal style to emulate. These players are disciplined, waiting for the right opportunities to strike, and when they do, they're relentless. They're the toughest opponents to beat and are found at the top of every serious game. If you want to learn more, be sure to read the full article on poker players' styles of play at pokerrailbird.com. I've placed the link in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more poker strategy content. Thanks for watching, and good luck at the tables.